Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our friends and colleagues around the world. My name is Larry Kelly, and welcome to the fourth session of the inaugural series of the World Affairs program of the MIT Club. I am thrilled to kick off our new program on the subject of world affairs, democracy, and freedom. The goal is to examine world affairs and to promote understanding and advancement of democracy and freedom around the world. And I am especially thrilled and excited to have as our speaker today, Adam Berinsky, the Mitsui Professor of Political Science at MIT, to talk about misinformation, its causes, how it spreads, and remedies for debunking. By the way, Serena tells me that our registration for tonight's event is over 100 people. As we heard from our earlier speakers, Larry Diamond, Steve Pfeiffer, and Karis Templeman in our prior sessions, democracy is under pressure around the world. Just reading today's news would give one enough material to fill up all the time allotted for our event today. Here's a sampling. The Ukraine war. Ukraine reports that Russian bombing has reduced Bakhmut almost completely to rubble. Putin is threatening to move nuclear arms into Belarus, and Russia has arrested Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich on espionage charges. China has conducted 3 days of military drills around Taiwan involving 12 warships and 91 aircraft, claiming to have sealed off the island. In Iran, while countless Iranian women are appearing in public without hijab, the Islamic Republic is installing cameras around cities to rein in the growing act of civil disobedience. The head of the traffic police of the capital, Tehran, said on Sunday that cameras installed for recording traffic violation also record cases of removing hijab. Turkey, which is reeling from soaring inflation and twin earthquakes that have left over 50,000 people dead, has elections scheduled for May 14th. Turkish voters will choose between the increasingly authoritarian incumbent, President Erdogan, and Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who is a unity candidate for 6 opposition parties. In Israel, according to The Economist, almost 7% of the population joined protests against Benjamin Netanyahu's proposals to weaken the judiciary. Netanyahu, who is coincidentally under corruption charges, has suspended his plan to rein in the judiciary and walk back his decision to fire the defense minister who opposed the changes. Protests continue. So, is this a weakening of democracy in the most and perhaps only democratic country in the Middle East? Or, as The Economist notes, this U-turn alone should cheer liberals and Democrats everywhere. Viktor Orban in Hungary, Andrzej Duda of Poland, and Recep Erdogan of Turkey all weakened or politicized their courts as a prelude to ramming through illiberal policies. By way of review, our speaker in February was Karis Templeman, research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Karis gave a fabulous and thought-provoking talk on can peace be preserved across the Taiwan Strait? And notwithstanding the drills that the PRC just completed in the Taiwan Strait, Karis was optimistic. I think he still is. If you missed any of these talks or want to hear them again, I'm putting a link to the recordings of Diamond's, Pfeiffer's, and Templeman's talks in the chat box. The World Affairs events are the ones with the blue background. Now it is my privilege to introduce our speaker, Adam Berinsky. Adam is the Mitsui Professor of Political Science at MIT and is the founding director of the MIT Political Experiments Research Lab. He is a specialist in the fields of political behavior and public opinion with over 25 years of experience. For the last decade, Adam has been studying political rumors and misinformation. He has published numerous articles and is the author of many books. His upcoming book, due August 15th, is titled Political Rumors: Why We Accept Misinformation and How to Fight It. It will be available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and elsewhere. Adam has won several scholarly awards, is the recipient of multiple grants from the National Science Foundation, and was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. In 2016, Adam was appointed a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellow to study how political rumors spread and how they can be debunked. He has spoken to numerous academic, professional, and public groups about his research, including many chapters of the MIT Alum Association. So, Adam, we're not first here at MIT CNC. He's spoken to attendees at the Nouveau Evolve Festival, various divisions at Meta, Facebook, at Google, at Twitter, and at the American Board of the Internal Medicine Foundation. He's also briefed the Democratic Congressional Caucus, the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense's Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Program, and the Finnish and Swedish governments about the implications of his research for developing policy strategies to fight misinformation. So before we start, Adam, your background. You grew up in New York City, you received your undergraduate degree from Wesleyan, you got your PhD from University of Michigan, Go Blue. Tell us a little bit about your formative years.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in New York City in the 1970s and 80s. I'm going to return to that a little later in the talk. But I guess I grew up in a political family. My father was a political photographer. So when I got to undergraduate, I was very interested in government. And I had a couple of professors who were sort of convinced me that being a professor would be a good job. And it's worked out really well for me. I get to be a political junkie as my main line of work, but I also get to be a social scientist. So really excited to be able to share some of what I've learned today with everyone.
Were there any interesting people during your early years that had significant influence on you?
Well, I think my undergraduate advisors. This was at Wesleyan. Sort of all respect to major research universities. I spent the last 25 years at Michigan, Princeton, and MIT, but I'm a big fan of the liberal arts college. Having that nice relationship with professors. Actually, I find that here I'm able to do that as well through the undergrad research opportunity program at MIT. Has been a great way to work closely with undergrads because no one comes to MIT wanting to be a social scientist. But we actually produce a lot of folks through econ, political science, and urban studies. People who go on to get PhDs. So it's nice to be able to foster that research relationship with the undergrads that I had as an undergrad at Wesleyan, very long time ago. Yeah.
What were some key pivotal moments in your career development that you might want to share with us?
Yeah, I think again, sort of I went into undergrad wanting to be a lawyer, and then my undergrad advisors encouraged me to go to graduate school. I think going to Michigan for me was a big moment. I've been East Coast guy, and I always said that except for my 5 years in Michigan, I've never lived more than a 15-minute ride from an Amtrak station on the Northeast Corridor. And so sort of having that experience in the Midwest, but also being at a really large research university, sort of exposed to different social sciences was really big for me.
Yeah, fabulous. Yeah. So why don't we get started? One last housekeeping detail. We've also enabled the chat box for questions for our audience, and I'll do my best to get many of these questions to Adam during the Q&A session, along with many of the questions pre-submitted in the online registration. Tonight's audience is large. We're just thrilled to have this many people attending. So we're only going to be able to, consequences, we're only going to be able to get to a small percentage of the questions live. And then I'll be back after Adam's talk to cover Q&A. So go for it, Adam.
Great, thanks. Okay, can everyone see that okay? Just want to make sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great. Okay. So tonight I'm going to be talking about political rumors, why we accept misinformation and how to fight it. And just as a word of warning, I'm going to be spending about equal time on both of those, but I think I have more answers on why we accept misinformation and, sort of less satisfying answers on how to fight it, but talk about some of the research that I've been doing. So I got into political rumors. Make sure I can, there we go. In the summer of 2009, I was interested in sort of two things that were going on. The first was rumors about Barack Obama's citizenship. So you might recall that in around the 2008 election, there was a lot of talk about, is Barack Obama eligible to be president, because questioning whether or not he was born in the US. So what I have here is the first of, this was taken in 2010, the first of about 25 Wikipedia pages about the controversy surrounding his citizenship. And you might recall that in April of 2011, after a lot of back and forth, Barack Obama released not the computer-generated birth certificate that you see here that he released during the presidential campaign, but the long-form birth certificate that was issued by the state of Hawaii. And so we think that maybe this would cause the rumors to stop. However, if you were, I always hesitate when I tell people to Google different rumors, but I don't want to send people down rabbit holes. But if you were to Google Barack Obama birth certificate, you would see that, in fact, a lot of people are questioning whether or not this is a real birth certificate. Some people say that the typeface in use on this birth certificate was not in use in the early 1960s. Others say that twins born in the same hospital on the same day have very different looking birth certificates. And what looks to me, and to hopefully to you, like a birth certificate, they claim is actually a multi-layer PDF forgery of a birth certificate. Right? So even responding to rumors with information, with hard facts, doesn't change the minds of some folks. And for me as a political scientist, and a political scientist who studies a lot of what's going on and how people think about politics, to me, this is a mystery, right? And so I was really interested in trying to figure out what was happening there. Okay, so my keyboard is a little responsive, hopefully. Okay, now, I'm going to be talking a lot about misinformation across the aisle, right? So it's not just misinformation or rumors about Barack Obama issuing from the right. There's also rumors on the left, right? So Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has become more prominent as an anti-vaccine advocate, recently declared that he's going to run for president in 2024. After the 2004 election, wrote this article for Rolling Stone, claiming that the 2004 election was stolen because the voting machines in Ohio that were manufactured by Diebold were, in fact, he claimed that there was electronic voting that wasn't counted, right? And so Diebold was a donator to the Bush campaign, also created the machines, and Kennedy made the claim that the election was stolen, right? So this is not just a matter of politicians on the right or folks on the right making these accusations. Rumors come from across the political spectrum. So I said I'd talk about my time in New York in the 70s and 80s, right? These rumors are not new, right? That this is something that's been around since the founding, right? So in my book, I talk about how there were rumors in revolutionary America about, sort of the role of the French, the role that Native Americans were playing, but this is nothing new, right? And so what's changed, though, is the form in which these rumors are disseminated. So what I have here, this was a poster that was put up on construction sites in the early 80s in New York. And so remember this. And so this claims that Reagan won the election, the 1984 election, not because of Mondale running a bad campaign or that Mondale sort of having a good economy that wasn't favorable to Mondale, basically saying that the election was rigged, that Mondale and Reagan were in it together. Mondale was working with Reagan, and that this is an intentional thing. So this is how rumors used to spread. But now, when we think about misinformation, it spreads through social media. So it's not that things have changed. It's not that rumors are new, but the volume and the speed with which rumors can travel is something that has changed over time. And so, I'll talk a little bit about misinformation, right? So many of you probably saw this image. This is the Pope's puffy coat. This is in fact not a real image. It's very stylish, but it's not true, right? That this was an AI deepfake that was created and spread through. So this is the kind of misinformation that we might think of as harmless, right? It's kind of funny, but it doesn't have big political implications. But there's lots of other kinds of information out there that do have implications. So, what are we talking about? So you've probably heard a lot of different terms: misinformation, disinformation, fake news, misperceptions, rumors, conspiracy theories. And about a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here is that these are kind of birds of a feather in a sense, right? That when I'm talking about misinformation, we're talking about things that are spread without sort of a consensus basis behind them, right? That we don't have evidence and we don't have authorities that are making these claims. So one other thing that you might have heard, I just wanted to throw up disinformation here as well, is that sometimes you hear the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Now, misinformation are, again, unsupported statements. Disinformation gets at the intent of the spreader, right? That someone would spread misinformation in an attempt to deceive, right? So if I'm someone who spreads something that I know to be false, I'm spreading disinformation. Now, the problem, though, is that when we try to make these comparisons, let's say I said to you tonight something that is false, and I'm not going to do that, right? I'm going to, I want to spread good information here. But if I was to spread something that was false, a piece of misinformation, for me, it would be disinformation to you. But if you in turn believe that and you spread it among your friends, it's misinformation. So really, we want to focus on these unsupported claims there. So I'm going to be using these terms interchangeably. I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about some differences there. But if you hear this difference between misinformation and disinformation, it's about the intent of the spreader. But at the end of the day, these are things that cause problems no matter what the intent of the initial spreader. So now, why do people spread this, right? So in the wake of the 2016 election, there was talk about folks in Macedonia. So Macedonian teenagers who are creating websites that try to get traffic to sell advertising. So here's an example of one of these Macedonian websites. Here's a couple stories about Clinton, about Obama. So this is fake news, right? This is news that is untrue, but the intent is trying to get people to these websites so that the creators of the websites can make money. But there's other kinds of misinformation out there as well, right? So kind of something that's more ambiguous. Pope Francis just backed Trump, released this incredible statement. Why? Spread this everywhere. And then you also have information from foreign actors. So here's an example of something that was spread by the Russian government that through the IRA that is intentional misinformation here. So it says save time, avoid the lines, vote from home, text Hillary to 59925. In fact, you can't do this, right? You can't vote by text message, but it was an attempted disinformation by the Russian government to spread this kind of misinformation out there. So it's not that misinformation needs to have a particular source or it needs to come from a particular type of person. Once it's out there spreading, then the intentions of the initial sender don't matter as much as the fact that it's polluted the information environment. And that's what I'm really worried about. And that's the kinds of things that I'm studying in my research. I was trained like a social psychologist. I run surveys to try to learn what do people think. And I run experiments to see, well, how can I change their mind? And so first thing I did was run surveys. Here's an example, July 2010 death panels. This is just an example of the kinds of questions that I was asking people. Here to say, do you think the changes to the healthcare system that have been enacted by Congress and the Obama administration create death panels, right? Basically have the authority to determine whether or not people live or die. And this is a question that I fielded in July 2010. And you can see here, I gave three options. 33% of people endorsed it. The good news is a plurality of people rejected it. So 46% said it wasn't true, but another 22% said that they were not sure. And this is something I really want to focus on, to think about, is that just because someone doesn't accept a rumor doesn't mean that they've rejected it fully. And so I think that this not sure response, this kind of ambiguous middle response, is something that's potentially dangerous when we think about how individuals engage with the political system. I'm going to be saying a little bit more about that later, but give you another example of sort of a rumor on the left. The truth of rumor. Do you think that people in the federal government either assisted with 9/11 or took no action to stop the attacks because they wanted the US to go to war in the Middle East? Right here, a majority reject, but we still have a chunk of people, 18%, who believe the rumor, and another 18% who say that they're not sure. And so this takes me to sort of the book that Larry mentioned that's going to be coming out this fall. My publisher would want me to say that. They'd probably be mad at me for not putting up a picture of the cover. But in this book, I take up two central questions, right? The first is, how is it that reasonable people, right? I'm going to say, largely, as I showed, if we have, 45% of people who reject the death panel rumor, it still means that there's 55% of people who either accept it or are not sure, right? That these are, some reasonable people. And how can they come to believe these bizarre stories about our political system and the politicians who run it? And then secondly, and perhaps more importantly, is how can we correct the false information? So I'm going to show you a little bit about this first thing. So this is the result of I showed you a couple of example questions there for this initial 2010 survey I ran. And over the last 15 years or so, I've run a number of surveys, and they all show essentially the same thing I'm going to show you here. So I asked about 7 different questions, sort of related to death panels, to truthers, ask about Obama's birth certificate. So kind of rumors from across the ideological spectrum. And what I find is, of these 7 questions, that it's the case that people accept on average about 2, they're not sure of about 2, and they reject about 4, right? So, sort of coming together these 7 questions, that the majority are rejected, but there's a bunch of folks who either accept or not sure. Now, one thing I want to highlight here, and the reason I'm showing you this distribution, is let's focus on these people who accept the rumors here, kind of this left panel. You can see that you sort of this room, about 28% reject them all, right? So it means that if I give you a list of 7 rumors, 28% of people say, well, I don't accept any of them. What that means, though, is that over 70% of the public will accept at least one rumor, right? And so the number of people who accept all the rumors is very small, right? The number of people who accept 6 or 7 of the rumors is only a trivial portion, about 3 or 4%. And so what I take from this, that it's not that there's there's some people who believe a lot of crazy things. There are, but it's a very small portion. What this shows me is that there's a lot of people who believe some crazy things. And so again, by crazy things, this misinformation, things that are unsupported by evidence. And so I really want to understand, how is it that we can understand this distribution belief through the public? Right. And so the question is, why do people endorse rumors? And this is what I spend the first half of my book talking about. And just want to kind of quickly run through that because I want to talk a little bit more about what I'm trying to do to reduce misinformation. But the first question I'm sometimes asked, do people really believe these rumors? In the book, I say yes. And I'm happy to talk about some experiments I've run to show that. But I'm also interested in what the structure of false belief is. It's really driven by 2 things. So the first is this general tendency for conspiratorial thinking. So I would say, think about the relative at a holiday that you always try to avoid because they always have some sort of crazy story. They're at one end of the spectrum. At the other end are people who reject everything, right? This is those 28% of the people who, if I showed you this list of 7 rumors, you reject them all. And so those are the extremes, but there's a lot of people in between, right? And so the thing about this is that there is this underlying psychological tendency. It's measured lots of different ways by social scientists, psychologists, political scientists, but the underlying story there is that some people are more likely than others to believe these stories. But it also matters not just this general tendency, but what the story is about. And so here's where the politics comes in, is the power of partisanship, right? So take, for example, the Obama citizenship rumor, right? It's that Republicans are more likely to believe that than Democrats because there's a political motivation there, right? Similarly, if we think about 9/11 as an inside job, Democrats are more likely to believe that than Republicans, because it's what we call motivated reasoning. But it's not the case that all Republicans believe that Obama wasn't born in this country, or all Democrats think that Bush was responsible for 9/11. It's the confluence of these two things, right? So it's Republicans who are high in conspiratorial thinking who think that Obama's faked his birth certificate there, right? So it's kind of bringing together the personality and the politics enables us to figure out who's going to believe these rumors. And so, sort of that set the stage for what I want to do next, which is looking at the second set here, which is how to correct rumors. Now, I should say, when going into this project, I started in 2009. I thought that this would be a 5-year project. My previous books took me about 5 years to write. I signed a book contract in 2012, promising to deliver it in 2014. And I finally delivered it last fall, 2021, so 7 years late. And I think in large part, this was because the second part was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. That rumors are hard to correct because they're sticky. That once misinformation is out there, it's hard to capture and it's hard to correct. But what I'm going to be talking about here is one strategy that I've used is focusing on the source credibility, right? So the idea is focusing not just who the argument that's being made, but thinking about who is making that argument. Because it's very tricky in the current age to think about, how can we have a fact checker come in and correct a story, right? So, so when I started this project, the idea is I thought that it would be a way of figuring out, okay, here's identifying pieces of misinformation, developing the correct information, and then figuring out a way to deliver that to individuals so they accept that information. The problem is that partisanship gets in a lot of the way here. That sort of that Republicans who are high on conspiratorial beliefs, you can tell them that fact checkers have said that Obama was in fact born in this country and the birth certificate checks out. It could be that they would accept that, or it could be that the reaction to be that to reject not just the information, that correction that you're giving them, but also to reject the authority of the fact checker to say whether or not something is true, right? So this is very difficult, figuring out who the arbiter of truth is. So in my work, I've been trying to figure out ways to think about who delivers that message there. So I'm going to show here, hopefully it'll come up. One time here. I'm going to think about how to fight misinformation. So I'm going to be talking about two things. The first is using source credibility, fighting individual rumors. And I'm going to be talking about some work that I've been doing in conjunction with David Rand, working with tech companies to think about how we can fight misinformation at scale. So let me begin by showing this clip here. And so hit play here. And this is a way to deliver the argument that I'm going to make on how we can fight misinformation, one piece of misinformation at a time.
I went to MIT to meet with an expert on disinformation and fake news, Adam Berinsky.
In the previous eras, you could turn to the media as the trusted source, right? Think about it in a basketball game. It's a referee, right? Someone.
Sorry,
okay,
so cricket.
I actually can't do cricket, but let's try
Rugby.
Do they have a referee in rugby?
I don't know. I don't watch it.
Well, I guess the problem in today is that there is no independent referee. And so you can get thinking about death panels, right? That there's this notion that.
Oh no, I know what death panels are. Yeah, we have them in England, so it's like a pretty small price to pay for free healthcare.
So we actually don't have death panels here. And these nonpartisan organizations, they said these aren't true, but those kinds of corrections just didn't stick. So instead, what works is if you have people speaking against their apparent interests, right? So having a Republican saying that death panels are false, that's the most effective.
We found the cure.
So it's an easy cure, hard to implement though.
So there is a cure, but the cure does not work.
Not always.
Adam, why am I even here?
Okay, so, oops, I'm not going to make you watch that again. So let me try that. Okay, so this kind of sets up this idea of this having, in a case where we don't have an impartial referee, right? If we can't bring in someone who can say this is true and this is false, how can we effectively convey true information? And so the subject of the experiments I'm going to show you were about this death panel on healthcare reform. So you might recall, this is a question I asked earlier, that when the Affordable Care Act was being debated in 2009 and 2010, there was a rumor circulating that the government was going to create death panels, that basically a group of doctors or politicians who would decide who gets to have healthcare and who doesn't. And so what I wanted to do, right, this is something that was patently false. There was no supporting evidence. There's a misconstrual of certain provisions in the Affordable Care Act. And so my idea was to take a look, could I correct misinformation, not just in the moment, but looking over time as well. And so I created an experiment where I presented people, randomly assigned them to one of 5 different conditions here. And so what I did was I took real articles and real quotes, right? Everything in the information I gave them is correct and true, but I emphasized different things. So I had a control condition where I didn't show them anything. The second condition I had was a rumor only. So here, so I'm showing you some highlighted text here. This wasn't highlighted when folks saw it, but just I wanted to kind of show the differences here. So here, I'm just basically presenting the rumor. So healthcare reform, will there be death panels? Talk a little bit about the Affordable Care Act. And then here I have these 2 statements, one by Betsy McConaughey, who says that the Affordable Care Act contained provisions that would make it mandatory that people in Medicare have a required counseling session that will tell them how to end their life sooner. And Chuck Grassley, who said, you have every right to fear. You should not have a government-run plan to decide when to pull the plug on grandma. Right. So again, everything here, these are actual quotes. These are talking about actual provisions. I'm only presenting the rumor. So the question is, can I correct this rumor? Right? How can I effectively rebut it? And one strategy is to have an independent organization. So this is a nonpartisan correction. Have the American Medical Association to say that this isn't the case. John Rother, the executive vice president of the AARP, said these are false, right? So here you can see the headline says setting the record straight. So here I'm bringing in a nonpartisan correction, right? To say, you might have heard this. Here's an authority, right? The American Medical Association weighing in and saying this doesn't actually happen. But from my theory, that this wouldn't necessarily be the most effective. But what would be most effective is having someone speak against their apparent interest, right? So this is kind of, think about this as the unusual correction, right? So the example I give is, think about McDonald's for many years sold a product, supersized French fries, which was basically 2 large fries put together. At some point in the 1990s, early 2000s, McDonald's stopped selling these. Now, right, McDonald's wouldn't say that, they didn't say like, oh, you shouldn't eat so many French fries. But if a company that makes its money by selling French fries is basically removing a product that is selling French fries, might suggest like, maybe you shouldn't be eating so many French fries, right? So think about this as the signal, right? Someone speaking against their apparent interest. In the case of McDonald's, it's in their monetary interest. In the case of politicians, if we have a Republican saying this isn't true, then they could be speaking against their political interest. And that's exactly what I did here in this 4th condition, where I have a rumor plus a Republican correction. So everything that you saw before, but I also have, I think, from John Isaacson saying that this is not true. I do the same with the Democratic correction here. So again, there's 5 different conditions. There's the control where they get nothing. There's the rumor only, the 2nd condition. The rumor and nonpartisan correction, 3rd condition. Another condition where you have a Democratic correction. And then the 5th condition, the one that I think is going to be strongest, we have a Republican speaking against their apparent interest. And my theory is that this would be the most credible. And so I ran an experiment where I presented people with these results. I'm going to show you here 2 things. So focus on the top for a second there. You can see in the control condition that this is the case where 58% reject the rumor, 13% accept the rumor, 30% would say not sure. So this is a baseline, right? If I show you nothing, what is, so what is the opinion there? And here I find if I present just the rumor, I can increase, I can decrease rumor rejection rates here. Goes from 58% to 43%. If I present the rumor and nonpartisan correction, I can basically get us back to control. So essentially, by presenting the rumor only, I can push down the rumor rejection rate. But by presenting the rumor and nonpartisan correction, I can only get us back to where we were at baseline. So basically, presenting the rumor and nonpartisan correction is just the same as doing nothing at all. But here, if we go to these later columns, you can see like the biggest impact here, the thing that increases the rumor rejection rate the highest is having the Republicans say, this is not true, right? And so this is the best news that I have to show you in terms of my results here, which is that showing the rumor and the Republican correction is better than showing them nothing at all. But there are still some troubling things here, right? So you notice I've been focusing on rumor rejection rates. If we look at rumor acceptance rates, that doesn't really move as much, right? So the excuse me, the in and out is on this not sure category, right? You can see that in the rumor, only 38% say not sure. The rumor and Republican correction, 18% say not sure. So there isn't a lot of difference in accepting the rumor, but you can kind of push people out of this middle category. Then the other not so great news is what happens when I go to these people 2 weeks later. You can see that basically rumors, the correction fades across the board. So the control is the same, so that's good. It means that if I showed you nothing 2 weeks ago, you're the same as you are today. Presenting the rumor, though, that sticks, right? The rumor rejection rate stays at 43%. But if you look at all these corrections, right, the nonpartisan, the rumor Republican correction, the rumor and Democratic correction, the effectiveness is all those corrections fades by about 8 or 10 points. And so, in fact, 2 weeks later, showing you the rumor nonpartisan correction is worse than showing you nothing at all. But it still suggests that there is the possibility here of rumor correction, not through these nonpartisan fact checkers, but by having people speak against their parent interests. Okay, so this is kind of on an individual level. I'm going to finish up my talk by talking about, so what can we do at scale? So, the problem thing is what I talked about is that you're essentially playing whack-a-mole, right? It's saying a piece of misinformation comes up. You need to target it, preferably with someone speaking against their parent interest. You can spend your whole day doing that because something new will pop up. So what we've been doing some work with Dave Rand in the business school here is thinking about how can we have large scale interventions, not necessarily telling people what's right or wrong, but getting them in a different frame of mind, right? So the idea here is that, people approach social media in sort of not a careless way, not in a thoughtless way, but in a way that they're not really thinking, right? It's sort of, you read stuff, you share it. What we're trying to do is to get people in an alternative state of mind, right? To get them to be a little more thoughtful, right? Not necessarily telling them what to share and not to share, but to say, think before you share. And the idea is that we can use these nudges to kind of push against the noise of social media in a way that is low touch and easily scalable. So what does this look like? So I'm going to show you some experiments that we've run, but the kinds of interventions that we're talking about are very simple, right? So we might ask people to evaluate a piece of content. So, before you scroll through a social media feed, I might show you this. Say, scientists discovered the most massive neutron star ever detected. So I ask you, to the best of your knowledge, is the above headline accurate, right? So the idea is I'm asking you to do an accuracy test before you approach social media. I can be more direct, though, and ask people, sort of have some tips here, right? Think carefully about the news with these tips. Be skeptical of headlines, investigate the source, watch for unusual formatting, check the evidence, right? So again, we're not telling people not to share particular pieces of content, but we're saying when you approach the news, right, think about what it is that you're sharing. We can do even more than that, right? We can ask people, how important is it to you that you only share news articles on social media if they're accurate? And so when we show this to people, the vast majority of people say that they think it is very important or extremely important. And the idea here is that by kind of you saying that, like you're reminding yourself, like, oh, this is something that is important there. Okay, I see that partisan norms here. So the idea is like, what happens when we have these different interventions? And what I'm going to show you here, we did kind of a horse race test. The evaluation, right, where I ask you to do one question, the long evaluation, where I ask you 3 or 4 questions, the importance, where I ask you how important it is, the tips, where I'm giving you these new tips, and ignore the stuff about the norms for right now. But what you can see is that when we give people these tips, the increase in sharing discernment, so kind of the relative share of sharing of fake news relative to true news goes down, right? That people become more discerning, that they're more likely to share, that they're less likely to share fake news, more likely to share true news. And this is driven, sorry, that was it. This is driven in large part by the fact that people are less likely to share bad news, right? That kind of having these tips decreases their willingness to share false items. Because I would say, like, if I wanted to stop the sort of the sharing of fake news on, say, Twitter, I would just get rid of the share button, right? You can't share anything, but it means that not only can you not share fake news, you can't share true news. So we want to have these kinds of interventions that affect both the sharing of true and fake news. And so this is, these experiments were done in the US. A lot of my work is US focused, but we're also interested in looking at this cross country. So this is something, this will be coming out in Nature Human Behavior soon. We did a study across Argentina, Australia, Brazil, China. You can see for yourself, different kinds of democracies, consolidated democracies, autocracies. And what we find is that this general mechanism, giving people these tips, either asking them to evaluate or giving them these different tips, you can see that basically in every country, except for Egypt and Mexico, Saudi Arabia, so you sort of a little borderline there, that in every country, giving these different light interventions increases discernment, right? That people are more discerning in what they share in terms of the relative balance of true and fake news there, right? And so here you can see this is true in all these countries, and then we have the overall mean there. Now, I should say that if we were to look at this, right, that we're not talking huge effects here, right? We're talking, we're moving discernment by about 3 or 4%, right? So there is no magic bullet here, right? It's not saying like, oh, this is going to solve the fake news problem. It's going to solve the problem of people sharing bad information. But what it does suggest is that these light interventions do work, right? And that it's something that is potentially scalable, and it's something that tech companies might be interested in doing. And in fact, we've partnered with different companies, with Facebook, with Twitter, to try to do these sorts of things on platform there. And so, that what I want to share here is not that these are the magic solutions, right? It's, sort of, I spent a lot of time writing my book because I kept looking for, okay, what is the magic bullet that's going to solve this misinformation problem? What does it look like? And just realize, like, there is no magic bullet, right? Instead, you can think about this as akin to the Swiss cheese model of pandemic response, for example. I think about this as, this is a Swiss cheese model of misinformation response. So the Swiss cheese model pandemic response says, every individual act isn't a magic bullet, right? So masks don't solve the problem of spread. Social distance don't solve the problem of spread. Vaccines don't solve the problem of spread. But if we think about these as imperfect solutions, that work on balance, but have holes in them, that is, if we layer different types of interventions on top of each other, masks on top of social distancing, on top of vaccines, the hope is that, that solutions that don't work on one problem might come through a different method, right? So similarly, I'd say that when we think about fighting misinformation, we really want to kind of throw everything up against the wall and see what sticks there. So that's about as hopeful as I get. So here, right, as I said, there's no magic bullet, right? What I've shown you today are 2 solutions that I think could work, right? Looking at different sources of authority here I talk about people speaking against their parent interest. But there's also different ways that we can think about crowdsourcing judgments. So I worked for a while as a consultant on Facebook on a product community review that was attempting to do this. Twitter, I was on the academic advisory board for a product that began as Birdwatch and is now Community Notes. That's still there today. But the idea is basically, how can we leverage the knowledge of the crowd and the interest of the crowd in order to get judgments that can be accepted by the crowd? Similarly, accuracy nudges that I've shown you, right, that these are things that could potentially work. But, sort of that a lot of what we're doing here that in the misinformation space at MIT is think about not just the academic work that I'm showing you today, but think about ways that we can apply that to the real world, working with tech companies, working with government, working with, sort of different authorities to think about what can we do to solve the misinformation problem. And so that brings me to the end of the talk, and thank you.
Adam, fabulous. Thank you so much. So let's go through some of the questions that have come in during registration and then again now while we're in session here. I've tried to group them into categories. So the first category is sort of regulatory and free speech. So this question is, who is to blame for misinformation? Should the consumers of misinformation be blamed for their gullibility? That's sort of the caveat emptor thing. Or should it be the suppliers of misinformation for taking advantage of the opportunity to get it out for free? Or should it be the market makers, the platforms, and the media for attempting to monetize it by selling ads? I mean, what do you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I would say like who not to blame are the people. So I think that the people who receive the misinformation. So think about political misinformation. So as a political scientist who studies political behavior, the first thing I always tell my class when they come and I say, you're unusual, right? You, the members of the class. See, most of the people, most of the time, don't care about politics and don't want to engage with politics. And I tell my students, you're different because you've chosen to take this class. So I'll say the same thing to the folks here tonight, is that you're weird, you're unusual, because you're interested enough in politics to spend some time on a Tuesday night listening to me talk about that, right? And so the average person doesn't think that way. And they shouldn't necessarily, we shouldn't blame them for that, right? That people are busy, they have their lives, their jobs. And so there's a lot of responsibility in terms of misinformation problem on the folks who disseminate that. So not just bad actors, but I think also politicians, right? And thinking about, sort of both on the left and the right in other countries as well, have the weaponization of misinformation and as for political ends is something that is a problem. So, in the book, I talk about this, sort of, political scientists, I talk about the people and the politicians. And so who's to blame? I say the politicians, but it's also true thinking about sort of the different channels that they're spread. So thinking, I always said, I was give the caveat that I've taken money from Twitter, Facebook, and Google. So take what I say with a grain of salt, so blame the politicians, but I think that there are things that could be done, right? And I think also that, so the kinds of interventions I talked about here, these nudges, I think are ways that could help at the margin there. Because the tricky thing, again, is that I talk to folks, I say, well, the tech companies, they're in this for the money, which they are, and they could just solve this problem overnight if, they just did this one thing. And I said, well, that part's not true. But this is a really, really difficult problem. But I would say, if we were to rank the blame, I would say politicians, tech companies, and then the people like way, way down there.
Yeah. And then, so what do you think about Section 230? Should that be changed? What and how would you change it?
Well, so I should say that I was going to be a lawyer and I chose not to be a lawyer. So I don't know. But, sort of that I'm aware of that, sort of, and I think also the regulation in Europe as well, right? There's a lot of privacy regulations. And so I think that there are things that can be done through government regulation. But again, the problem there is thinking about who gets to define, sort of what is and what isn't free speech, and who gets to define what is and what isn't the truth. It becomes a political question. So I don't think there's going to be a magic solution there, right? Even if we you sort of talk about having more of the onus on the tech companies, that I think that there are certain tech companies that would love to have someone come in and have regulations around, like external regulations around, content that wouldn't be allowed, because they don't want to be in this business. And so I think that is tricky. But on the other hand, finding a neutral arbiter, right, finding that referee on that Samantha Bee clip I showed is really impossible. So, right, as someone who's not a lawyer, I would say, like, there could be some solutions there. But as someone who's a political scientist, I would say, the fundamental problem is the same, in that we need that at the end of the day, someone has to, an authority needs to decide what is and what isn't acceptable content. And that is a political question, and increasingly so.
Yeah, it sure is. Yeah. So there was an article, I think I saw it today, that in the PRC, the government has decided that to regulate chatbots, chat GPT and others, and to restrict them from making any comments about socialism and values. So
yeah. Right. So I think it is. And, actually, okay, now I'll go to another, because the problem is that I could talk forever about anything, but I do want to get to other questions.
All right. Okay. So, so here's another group of questions that have to do with where are we now? What resources are available? Do you have practical advice for identifying and responding to false information? You covered some of this already. Are there case study examples to learn from? Could we fight misinformation more effectively if we had access to social media data or access to some other data? I have read, the person submitting the question said, I have read that bias is a predictor of fake news. I think your data shows that. Do you have any suggestions for websites that measure bias of media and news?
Yeah, so I think media matters, right? So again, so, it's right, like when in my talk where I basically say, no one listens to fact checkers, that's a descriptive statement. That's not a normative statement, because I'm a very big believer in professional journalism and kind of these neutral fact checkers. So I would say, look, if you're interested for yourself to figure out, what is true and what is not, look to these websites that run by fact checkers, where it's not just they say, oh, this is true, this is false, right? They present information, evidence with authority to do that, right? And so I think that I saw that kind of flipping through the chat here, that said that I've presented rumors as something that's necessarily false, and it's not necessarily true, right? Sometimes rumors turn out to be true, right? So I said, like, Watergate was before my time, but I studied it a lot. Watergate was a rumor until a false rumor until it wasn't, right? But what I'm really concerned about, again, is misinformation, right? So things that are not supported by evidence coming from respected authorities. And so I think that for this audience, I would say, if you personally are interested in this, that's the way to look at it. But again, this is an unusual audience, right? That most people, most of the time, are not going to accept the, sort of the fact checker authority, because of things politicized, right? So, I often talk about my mother-in-law. So my mother-in-law, she's very into different things. She'd like send me, she's of the age where she would forward me emails like, oh, what about this rumor? What about this? And I'd say, no, KT, that's not right. That's not true. Go to this website. And then after a while, she said, you keep sending me to this factcheck.org, but my friends tell me it's just a liberal bias, and so I'm not going to believe it, right? And so one reaction among, people who don't accept that is to say, I'm not going to accept the evidence, I'm going to reject the authority. And so I would say for individuals who are interested in this audience, who are interested in looking, that's where I would go. But if we're looking at solutions that can scale up, like we should have the right, experts should have the authority, but in today's day and age, it's not necessarily the case. So we need to think about other ways to convey, right? So we need to figure out what the truth is and then figure out who's the best person to convey that message.
So factcheck.org
Mhm.
is a good site. Are there other
Yeah.
sites you'd recommend?
Yeah, so Snopes.com is another one that I sort of look at. But I think, in general, sort of that there are these different organizations. But part of the problem is that there's a selection bias problem in here, is that they only fact check things that become prominent. And so
course.
that's, it becomes very tricky, right? To think, something that's,
Yeah. Would you like to see a company be created to build solutions for misinformation?
Yeah, I know, I think it'd be great. I mean, I think that, but I'd say that there's a lot of, there is a lot of interest in tech companies in this sort of work. And so kind of, that thinking about, again, I've taken mine from Facebook, so take this with a grain of salt, is that that there's worry that if the public comes to view Facebook as a bunch of trash, that they're basically like, I don't know whether to trust this or not. I'm not sure if this is good or bad information, that affects the overall product. So, Facebook is very concerned about its sort of how it's presented and its public reputation. So I'd say tech companies are interested in that extent. At the same time, I think there's a question there about, would things be easier if tech companies shared their internal data? The answer is yes, right? We could learn a lot more than we can now. So we shouldn't put our faith just in the tech companies. So I think kind of this academic industry partnership kind of things, I think that's what I think is going to be the most effective. So, thinking about like, would it be great to have a company that would fight misinformation? Yeah, for what's the business model there? I think, it's like that's, yeah. So, but I think that, thinking about the kinds of government research, US government funded research, different foundations that are funding the kind of work, because this is a huge space. What I showed you today was, here's 2 things that I've been working on, but I'm working on a bunch of other stuff, and there's lots and lots of other researchers who are doing that as well. So there's a lot of work out there, but it's, sort of making the connections between academics and industry, and also getting government officials. So not government regulation per se, but, things like folks in the Defense Department, people in the State Department interested in this. Finding that partnership can be very tricky, but I think we're thinking about like, what's an actual solution. I think that's something that's going to work.
Yeah, not easy. Yeah. So, okay. So some specific predictions and situations, focusing on some of these suggestions or questions that came in. How likely is it that a deep fake about the death or assassination of a major leader or celebrity would cause significant protests and riots and so forth? I guess it probably depends a lot on the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I should say that, this was true like 3 or 4 years ago. There was a lot of worry about deep fakes in video. And then it sort of settled down, but with the chat GPI and sort of this, that it's coming up again. So I think comes and goes, but, I would remind folks that, deep fakes are one way that you can falsify misinformation, or create misinformation. But, there's, sort of a cheap fake, right? So I showed you that clip from the Samantha Bee show that I showed you was actually the composite of, 6 or 7 different mini parts of the interview, right, that were put together there in the story. And it made me look good, which I liked, but, she could have very easily gone through, if she wanted to make me look bad, right, it'd been very easy to construct that. So this was a promo for a larger segment. I actually just showed my undergrad class the segment yesterday, but there's a guy in Finland who's like basically a Russian troll. And he sat down, did an interview with her, and he looks horrible. But I can see, right? It's like I talked to the correspondent for 2 hours, right, to get the 30 seconds you saw and another 30 seconds that was on the show. So we don't need technology to do that, right? We can do that with cheap fakes. But also, sort of thinking about, sort of the Photoshop, in my lifetime, I've seen, sort of no one necessarily believes photos, right? Anymore. Like when I was a kid, like you saw a photo, like that was right. Seeing is believing. But now, it's in the nature that photos are very easily changed.
Yeah.
So I think, I think again, things will sort of move. So I guess I'm less, sort of the more things change, the more they stay the same. I think it's going to be the same with deep fakes. So, I mean, it's not to say it's not a problem, but I would, I think the bigger problem is the spread of misinformation, not necessarily the ease of creation of misinformation.
It's the spread. You're right. Yeah. Do you think this is contributing to the loss of confidence in our institutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is, but it's all sort of rolled together. I mean, so, one thing is to think about, sort of I said like, oh, disinformation is just misinformation, sort of spread intentionally. But I think looking at what the Russian government did in this country in 2016, I think is a really good case in point, right? Is that it's not that the Russian government was trying to get Donald Trump elected. In fact, they thought that Trump was going to lose, but they thought in a condition under which Clinton is going to be president, how can we create enough, sort of uncertainty and ambiguity and distrust of her that when she comes into power, she's going to be ineffective there, right? And so I think like a lot of the, thinking about that is important, so that misinformation can definitely affect, and not only can it affect, for foreign actors, that's the goal, right? To try to destabilize. And you see Russia has done this in other countries as well. Sort of before the actual invasion, kind of information warfare with Ukraine. The reason that I started talking to the Finnish government was because they were worried about Russian disinformation coming in, and so like, how can they deal with that?
Right. So generative AI and large language models and Chat GPT, which has been called a BSer at scale. Is there a way to use AI to prove the truth?
I mean, so I guess that partially, sort of like the question is like, what is true?
What is true? Yeah.
And so I don't, sort of, I don't want to get sort of, I don't want to sound like a philosopher. I have great respect for philosophers, but it's not what I do. But it's sort of what I'm concerned about is, again, it's evidence backed by authority, right? And so to think about, we need some way to come up with like, this is something we should support. But I'm more interested in how that can be delivered. You could see that potentially, that with, sort of artificial intelligence or ChatGPT, that you could think about different ways that you could play with the message, and to see what could be more effective. So I guess that sort of everything that I've talked about in terms of, correction, so that first part of my talk, can we target specific pieces of misinformation? It all presumes that we know what that misinformation is. And we say that something is misinformation if it's not supported. And so we want to target that. So I think these tools could potentially be useful, right, in that regard, in fighting that. But in terms of generating sort of evidence and the authority behind that evidence, I don't think that can play a role.
Yeah, probably not. So here's an interesting question. What about the criminal use of Chat GPT?
In terms of
could it be used? Is there a potential for it being used in a criminal way?
Sure, yeah. Well, I could say like in I guess plagiarism isn't well, I think it's a serious crime, right? But sort of like in education right now, there's a lot of worry about sort of students presenting papers like that. So I think any sort of communication there, I guess that but I guess here's the fundamental thing is that if your goal is to spread misinformation, that's a lot easier than correcting misinformation. Because for the same idea, I was talking about the Russia Today. So here's an example of the Finnish government I'd like to give is when I went there for the first time, they told me a story. So we're worried about this misinformation that's undermining Finnish society. So Russia Today, the media arm, ran a story that said that the Finnish government was taking children of Russian nationals, so people of Russian citizenship living in Finland, taking the babies and selling them to gay couples in America. And it's like, wow, yeah, it's just ridiculous. And so this is a story that I told several times. And I went back a couple of years later. I said, I keep telling that story. It's very striking. It's like, what's going on with that now? And they said, well, now there's a different story. Russia Today is saying the Finnish government is taking babies from Russian nationals because they're worried about the population in Finland, right? They're trying to repopulate Finland to slow the population decline by keeping Russian babies. So you can't both sell the babies and keep the babies, right? But they don't care, right? That all they care about is trying to create this distrust. So I would say that, so when we're talking about these different methods, it's just so much easier to create chaos and misinformation than it is to clean it up. Because, again, like, I don't need to get you to believe any one story. I just need to get you to distrust everything, right? Distrust all authority. And so I think that would be something that I would focus on.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, this has been really fabulous. Maybe one last question. What advice would you have to someone starting out in this field or making a career transition, wants to have a career doing this?
Good. Do you like sort of think about misinformation? And
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think the really interesting stuff right now, I think is going on is at the, sort of the intersection of social science and computer science. And so I guess this is a plug for, the MIT way, the new College of Computing. But, I found that over the last 10 years or so, I found myself working more and more with computer scientists, not necessarily faculty, that I do work with some faculty, but graduate students who are working at the intersection, right, who will come take my classes, or, graduate students who are studying computer science. It's like, oh, I want to learn a little bit about the social science behind this. And so like I have some grad students right now in my undergrad misinformation class. I've had some computer science grad students who have taken my graduate public opinion courses. So I would say, sort of, it's not an either or, right? It's not social science or computer science, but I would say kind of working in that intersection, I think it is really interesting, and in a way that wasn't really true, I would say 10 or 15 years ago, that things were more siloed. But, in tech companies, there's more social scientists. In government, there's more computer scientists. So
Yeah, it's true.
I would say, when I talk to undergrad, there's so many undergrads who are, course 6, but also a social science. So we have political science double major. I was just talking to a first year this morning who's going to do some Europe work for me, and she said, I want to be a computer scientist, but I want to do it on problems that matter, and I want to think like a social scientist. I was like, great, but you're exactly what I'm looking for.
Yeah. Fabulous. Yeah. Adam, thank you so much.
My pleasure. It's always fun to talk. And we didn't mention that. I should say that I'm also the head of Ashdown House, and so I've been speaking to you from the grounds of MIT in my apartment in NW 35. So this is not the Ashdown House that's on the river. That's now Massey Hall, but it's Ashdown House at the corner of Albany and Pacific. So not only am I speaking to you about MIT and the research I'm doing here, I've given you a touch of MIT there as well. So.
And you've been the housemaster at Ashdown for 10 years, 12 years?
10 years, yeah. We're
10
just
years.
finishing up our 10th year here. So
Yeah.
my kids have grown up here. So it's
That's fabulous. Yeah. Well, you're committed. You're really committed to the Institute, and all of us who have a connection thank you for that.
That's good. That's a lot of fun to talk about.
Yeah. So Adam, wow, thanks so much for this overview on misinformation and the ways to debunk it. This is really, really fabulous. It's as Diamond and Pfeiffer and Templeman pointed out before, is that the information or the disruption of quality information was one of the key problems that authoritarians used to weaken democracy and, through the spreading of misinformation, and they, it happens, for example, through media control. So thank you so much for going. This is a really key topic for democracy. Thank you so much for doing
My
this.
pleasure.
I got some good tips here. Evaluate, give tips, evidence backed by authority. How is it delivered? It reminds me of that statement. I've forgotten who made it. You can fool some of the people all the time,
Mhm.
you know that one, right? So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and perspective and providing so many good insights. As we like to say at MIT, I'm sure you've heard this many times, it's like getting the proverbial drink of water out of a fire hose. I learned so much from you, not only in January when you were here, but also this time. So thanks so much. To our audience, thank you so much for the astute questions. There were a lot of them, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. There was some great chat that went back and forth in the chat window, and I think people were giving information back and forth. There was another news source in there. If you save, you can save the chat, and you can pick up that URL for that news source. So our next event, thank you, Serena. Our next event is on Wednesday, May 17th, same time, 5:30. We have another MIT professor from course 17. It's Barry Posen. He's the MIT Ford International Professor of Political Science, and he's going to address the subject of United States national security policy and military strategy. Barry has some very interesting ideas on American foreign policy, on American national security, and on military strategy. It is a little different than, he's not Donnie Rumsfeld. I think he'll give us some different ideas on what we should be doing. And it's going to be very thought-provoking. So save that date, Wednesday, March 17th. We'll see you at 5:30. And again, one more time, thank you, Adam. Thanks so much for the excellent presentation. And go Warriors and Celtics. You both made it to the playoffs. Time to finish with a flourish. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.